In the spring of 1993, a Georgia corporation that had existed for fewer than 3 years signed the papers to acquire a farm equipment company that had operated in the same Ohio town for nearly a century. The deal closed quietly. There was no ceremony in Coldwater. There was no crowd outside the factory gate. The name on the gate was New Idea. The corporation that bought it was AGCO. It had been founded in 1990. New Idea had been founded in 1899. One of these two companies had spent 94 years building the machines that harvested the American corn crop and returned fertility to the American soil. The other had spent 3 years assembling a portfolio. The paperwork took less time than one corn harvest. A decade before that signature, the New Idea plant in Coldwater, Ohio was running double shifts before the autumn harvest season. Mercer County machinists, men whose fathers had worked the same floor, were assembling corn pickers and manure spreaders that would ship to farm implement dealers across Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Ohio. The backlog ran to weeks. The factory could not build them fast enough. But the real story of New Idea is not the acquisition. It is not the conglomerate's signature on a purchase agreement. It is the story of how a single invention, built in a town of 4,000 people in western Ohio, mechanized one of the hardest jobs in American agriculture, and how the machine that fed a nation could not, in the end, feed the company that made it. America built the farm, America tooled it, America lost the machine. We tell the stories of how that happened one brand at a time. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. This story begins in Coldwater, Ohio in 1899. Coldwater, Ohio sits in Mercer County in the flat agricultural plain of the state's western border. In 1899, it was a town of grain elevators, feed stores, and implement dealers. The farms surrounding it ran to the horizon in every direction: corn, wheat, oats, and hogs. The soil was deep and productive. The labor required to work it was relentless. The hardest job on a Midwest farm in 1899 was not planting. It was not harvesting. It was spreading manure. Every autumn and every spring, after the animals had wintered in their barns and generated months of accumulated waste, a farmer had to load that material onto a wagon by hand, drive it to the field, and spread it by hand, shovelful by shovelful, across every acre that needed fertility restored. On a farm of 160 acres, that work consumed 3 to 4 full days of labor, every season, every year. A strong man with a good team of horses could cover roughly 2 acres per hour. The mathematics were brutal. The work was worse. There were attempts at mechanical spreaders before 1899. Joseph Kemp and H.T. Burpee in Syracuse, New York, had built an early horse-drawn model in the 1870s. It worked after a fashion. It also broke down regularly, jammed in wet material, and delivered an uneven distribution across the field that left fertility concentrated in strips and gaps where nothing grew well. The American farm market had seen the idea. It had not yet seen one that worked. In 1899, a group of investors and implement men in Coldwater set out to build one that did. The company they incorporated was called the New Idea Spreader Company. The name was not marketing. In a market where farmers had watched mechanical promises fail in the mud of their own fields, calling your product a new idea was a declaration of intent, a claim that what came before did not count, and that what you were about to show them was different. The machine they built was different. The New Idea horse-drawn manure spreader used a moving floor, a chain-driven apron that traveled slowly toward the rear of the box, carrying the load with it. At the back, a set of steel beater paddles, horizontal bars rotating at speed, struck the material as it arrived, breaking it apart and throwing it in a wide, even arc across the field behind the machine. 2 horses pulled it. 1 man drove it. It covered 8 to 12 acres per day under normal field conditions, 5 to 6 times the output of hand spreading, with a distribution uniformity that no shovel work could match. The first production models sold for approximately $80 in 1899. That price represented roughly 6 to 8 weeks of wages for a farm laborer in western Ohio. It was not a small sum, but the calculation that a farmer made was simple. One machine, properly maintained, would return its cost and saved labor within 2 seasons. After that, it worked for free. The implement dealers of western Ohio were the first channel. Small county seat operations in Mercer, Auglaize, and Darke counties took the early inventory. The machine demonstrated well at county fairs, where a New Idea representative would load the spreader, drive a team across a demonstration field, and let the crowd watch the beaters do in 40 minutes what 3 men with shovels could not finish before noon. Orders followed the demonstrations. By 1905, New Idea spreaders were shipping to dealers across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. By 1910, the company had expanded its Coldwater facility and was employing several hundred workers from the surrounding county. The Thomas Register of American Manufacturers listed the New Idea Spreader Company among its Ohio agricultural implement entries before 1910, a placement that gave the brand legitimacy in the eyes of the purchasing agents and farm supply wholesalers who used the register as their sourcing Bible. The spreader line was profitable. It was not by itself large enough. Corn was the crop that defined the American Midwest. In 1920, the United States harvested approximately 3.1 billion bushels of corn from 100 million acres, the largest corn acreage in American history to that point. Every bushel of that crop had to be picked from the standing stalk by hand, or by a mechanical picker that could keep pace with the scale of the harvest. Hand-husking crews, teams of men moving through the rows, stripping ears from stalks and throwing them into a wagon, could cover 4 to 6 acres per day under favorable conditions. A Corn Belt farmer with 200 acres of corn needed weeks of coordinated labor to bring his crop in before the weather turned. New Idea saw the market. In the early 1920s, the company's engineers in Coldwater began development work on a tractor-drawn corn picker, a machine that could snap the ears from the standing stalks, remove the husks mechanically, and elevate the clean corn into a wagon running alongside. It was a more complex engineering problem than the spreader. It required precision in the snapping rolls, the paired steel cylinders that grabbed the corn stalk and pulled the ear downward against the snapping plates, and durability in the husking bed, where a series of rubber-covered rollers stripped the husk leaves from the ear without damaging the kernels. The first New Idea corn pickers reached the market in the mid-1920s. They were not the first corn pickers in America. International Harvester and several smaller manufacturers had been working the problem for years. But the New Idea design established a reputation for husking efficiency, for leaving less crop on the ear and less crop on the ground, that would define the brand's competitive position for the next 4 decades. Coldwater had found its second product. It would prove to be the one that defined the company. By the early 1950s, the New Idea corn picker had evolved from its mid-1920s prototype into a mature, refined machine that American Corn Belt farmers trusted the way they trusted a good team of horses, with the specific earned confidence of men who had watched it perform under pressure and found it sound. The machine itself, at its production peak, was a study in functional American engineering. The snapping rolls, paired steel cylinders mounted at the front of the picking unit, set at an angle that matched the row spacing of a standing corn crop, grabbed each stalk as the machine moved forward and pulled it downward at high speed. The ear, too large to pass between the rolls, snapped free from the stalk at the shank and was thrown rearward onto the husking bed. The stalk continued downward and was discharged back onto the field. The whole action happened faster than the eye could follow. Thousands of times per hour, row after row, acre after acre. The husking bed was where New Idea had built its reputation. A series of paired rollers, covered in hard rubber and set at a slight angle to the direction of travel, received each ear as it arrived from the snapping rolls. The rollers grabbed the husk leaves and pulled them away from the ear, stripping it clean and dropping the bare cob onto an elevator that carried it upward and into the wagon running alongside. The husk material fell through the rollers and onto the ground. The clean corn went to market. The critical measurement was field loss, the percentage of the harvested crop that ended up on the ground rather than in the wagon through dropped ears, shelled kernels, or incompletely husked cobs. A well-adjusted New Idea 2-row picker in a standing corn crop of average yield ran field losses of 2 to 3%. Hand-husking crews, working fast in good conditions, ran losses of 1 to 2%. The mechanical picker was not perfect, but it covered ground at a rate no crew could match. And in a wet autumn, when a Corn Belt farmer had a narrow window between the crop reaching maturity and the first hard freeze making harvest impossible, the speed was worth the small additional loss. A New Idea 2-row pull-type corn picker in 1955 carried a dealer list price of approximately $900 to $1,100, roughly $10,000 to $12,000 in current terms. The comparable International Harvester 2-row picker listed at a similar price point. The comparable John Deere model was priced within $100 in either direction. New Idea did not win on price. It won on husking performance and on the reliability of a machine that Coldwater had been refining since the 1920s. The distribution network was the second advantage. New Idea operated through a system of independent implement dealers. not the John Deere dealer in the county seat who also sold planters and tillage equipment and whose service department was already stretched across 6 product lines, but dedicated farm equipment retailers whose inventory included new idea spreaders, corn pickers, and the forage equipment line the company had begun adding in the 1940s. A farmer who bought a new idea corn picker in 1955 bought it from a dealer who stocked new idea parts, had a new idea trained mechanic on the floor, and would answer the phone on a Saturday morning in October when a snapping roll bearing failed with 200 acres still standing in the field. That service infrastructure was the moat that International Harvester's larger dealer network could not easily penetrate at the county level. IH had more dealers. New Idea had dealers who sold nothing else. The Ohio State University Agricultural Extension Service and Purdue University's Agricultural Engineering Department both published comparative picker performance studies in the 1950s. New Idea appeared in these reports consistently, not always first in every category, but consistently competitive on husking efficiency and kernel damage rates, the two metrics that Corn Belt farmers used to evaluate picker performance before they consulted the price list. A favorable extension service report, circulated to county agents across Ohio and Indiana, moved more implement inventory than any advertising campaign. New Idea earned those reports across multiple testing seasons. The institutional endorsements followed the performance data. The Ohio Farm Bureau, whose county affiliates served as informal purchasing advisors to tens of thousands of member farm families, listed New Idea among its approved equipment suppliers through the 1950s. The Indiana Farmers Union reached similar conclusions. Dairy cooperatives in northern Ohio and Indiana, who needed reliable spreader equipment to manage the manure volumes of commercial dairy operations, specified New Idea spreaders in their member farm recommendations. The United States Department of Agriculture's agricultural mechanization surveys of the mid-1950s documented a Corn Belt harvest that was shifting rapidly from hand labor to mechanical picking. In 1940, approximately 30% of the American corn crop was harvested mechanically. By 1955, that figure had risen to over 70%. New Idea was not the only company building corn pickers, but in the western Ohio, eastern Indiana, and northern Illinois markets where its dealer network was strongest, the company held a regional market share that its larger competitors, International Harvester, John Deere, Massey Harris, could not displace without a product advantage they did not yet possess. The nameplate on the picker's side panel was not a city of origin. It was a promise that the crop would make it to the wagon. The autumn of 1958 was a good corn year in the American Midwest. The USDA reported a national corn harvest of 3.57 billion bushels from approximately 57 million harvested acres, a crop that would move through elevators in Decatur, in Toledo, and Chicago, into the feedlots of Kansas and Nebraska, into the wet mills and dry mills that converted American corn into everything from livestock feed to industrial starch to the corn syrup that sweetened American food at every income level. The harvest had to come in fast. The window between physiological maturity and the first hard freeze in western Ohio ran to perhaps 6 weeks in a good year. In a wet year, it ran to less. On a 320-acre corn farm in Clark County, Ohio that autumn, a farmer running a New Idea 2-row pull-type picker behind a Farmall M tractor covered his crop at a rate of approximately 8 to 10 acres per day under normal field conditions. The snapping rolls turned at a speed calibrated to the tractor's ground travel, fast enough to keep the ears moving rearward, slow enough to minimize stalk wrapping, the condition in which wet corn stalks wound themselves around the roll shaft and jammed the entire picking unit in the middle of a row. The husking bed stripped each ear clean in the 2 seconds it spent between the rollers. The elevator chain carried the bare cobs up and over into the wagon at a rate that kept the wagon consistently 3/4 full, which was the load the farmer's farmall could pull across a soft field without spinning its rear tires into the subsoil. His field loss ran to approximately 2.5%. On a 320-acre farm yielding 65 bushels per acre, that was roughly 520 bushels of corn left on the ground, worth, at 1958 prices of $110 per bushel, approximately $572 across the full harvest. It was not a number a farmer ignored. But the alternative, hand-husking crews at $125 per man per hour, requiring 8 men for 12 days to cover the same acreage, cost $1,140 in labor alone, before food and housing were accounted for. The machine left money on the ground. It left less money on the ground than the crew cost to hire. After that harvest season, the Clark County implement dealer who carried New Idea reported his strongest October in 6 years. The backlog on 2-row picker orders ran to 3 weeks. Coldwater ran an extended production shift through November to clear it. That was the rhythm of the new Idea factory at its peak. Spring production built spreader inventory for the April and May planting season. Summer production built corn picker inventory for the September and October harvest. The Coldwater plant employed between 900 and 1,200 workers at its production peak. Men and women from Mercer County and the surrounding townships, many of them from farm families who understood exactly what the machines they assembled were designed to do, and why the tolerances on the snapping roll gap setting mattered when a farmer was trying to finish 200 acres before a cold front arrived from Lake Erie. The spreader line had grown substantially since 1899. By the late 1950s, New Idea offered ground-driven spreaders in multiple box capacities, a PTO-driven spreader line, PTO standing for power takeoff, the rotating shaft on the rear of a tractor that transferred engine power directly to an implement's working components, and the beginnings of a liquid manure spreader program aimed at the commercial dairy operations of northern Ohio and Indiana that were generating manure volumes beyond what a conventional dry spreader could handle efficiently. The forage harvester line, added in the 1940s, served the dairy and beef cattle farms that needed chopped hay and silage rather than dry corn. Each product line fed a different segment of the Corn Belt and Great Lakes farming economy. Together, they gave New Idea a breadth of implement coverage that its smaller competitors could not match. The company appeared in the Farm Journal, Successful Farming, and Implement and Tractor throughout the 1950s, not in full-page national advertising campaigns, but in the implement dealer directories and regional equipment listings that working farmers actually consulted when they needed to know where to buy a picker and who would service it. The brand was not glamorous. It was not nationally celebrated the way John Deere's two-cylinder tractors were celebrated, or the way International Harvester's Farmall line had become embedded in the iconography of American farm life. New Idea was a specialist's brand, known deeply by the farmers who used it, invisible to everyone else. That was precisely the kind of brand that a conglomerate would eventually find attractive, not for its culture, for its market position. In 1945, the New Idea Spreader Company was acquired by AVCO Corporation, the Aviation and Vehicle Corporation, a Hartford, Connecticut conglomerate whose primary business was aircraft engines, defense electronics, and industrial manufacturing. AVCO had no background in farm implement design. It had no agronomists on its board, no engineers who had spent an October morning in a corn belt field watching a husking bed work through wet ears. What it had was capital, a preference for acquiring profitable niche manufacturers, and a conviction that the post-war American economy would reward diversified industrial holdings, regardless of whether the acquiring company understood what the acquired company actually made. The Coldwater plant continued to operate. The workers came in on the same shifts. The corn pickers shipped on the same seasonal schedule. From the outside, nothing had changed. The New Idea name remained on the gate. The letterhead remained the same. But the profits from a farm implement company in western Ohio were now flowing to a defense and aviation conglomerate in Hartford, Connecticut, a company whose strategic priorities lay in jet engine components and missile guidance systems, not in snapping roll metallurgy or husking bed roller durability. The research and development budget that a family-controlled implement company might have reinvested into the next generation of corn harvesting technology was now subject to the capital allocation decisions of an executive team that measured return on investment across a portfolio that included radar systems and aircraft fuselages. The Coldwater engineers continued their work. But the institutional urgency, the competitive pressure to get the next product right before a rival did, was filtered through a corporate structure that did not feel that urgency the way a company whose entire existence depended on one product line in one American agricultural market would feel it. For nearly 2 decades, the consequences of that structural change were invisible. The post-war American farm economy was expanding. Corn acreage was growing. The farm mechanization wave that the USDA had documented through the 1950s continued into the 1960s. New Idea corn pickers kept selling. The spreader line kept expanding. The forage harvester business grew alongside the commercial dairy industry of the Great Lakes region. AVCO held the asset. The asset performed. What was accumulating beneath the surface of those performing numbers was a technology gap. In 1969, John Deere introduced a cornhead attachment for its 6600 combine harvester. The cornhead, a multi-row gathering and snapping unit that mounted directly on the front of a self-propelled combine, allowed a single machine to harvest corn, shell the grain from the cob in one pass, and deliver clean grain directly to a grain cart or truck running alongside. The combine moved through a cornfield and left behind a windrow of shredded stalks and cobs. The grain was already separated. Already clean, already ready for the elevator. There was no picker, no separate wagon, no second trip through the field with a shelling unit. One machine, one pass, one operator. The pull-type corn picker, New Idea's core product, required a tractor, a picker, a wagon, and a separate operation to shell the ear corn before it could be sold at the elevator or stored in a grain bin. The combine corn head eliminated every one of those steps. For a large commercial grain farm in Indiana or Iowa running 800 acres of corn, the economic argument for the combine corn head was unanswerable. The pull-type picker belonged to a different era of corn farming, the era of the family operation, the 200-acre farm, the farmer who could not afford a combine, and who justified the picker on the grounds that it got the crop in fast enough, and the ear corn could be stored in a crib through the winter and sold when prices improved. That farmer was aging. His children were not necessarily farming the same acreage in the same way. International Harvester followed John Deere into the combine cornhead market. Case followed. Gleaner, built in Independence, Missouri, offered combine cornhead configurations that worked with its own rotary combine platform. By the mid-1970s, every major American combine manufacturer offered a cornhead that made the pull-type picker an increasingly difficult sale to any farm operation above a certain scale. New Idea did not build combines. It had never built combines. To compete in the combine cornhead market, the company would have needed to either develop its own combine platform, an investment of tens of millions of dollars and years of engineering development, or find a combine manufacturer willing to certify a New Idea cornhead for use on its machine. Neither path was straightforward for a company whose parent corporation was a defense and aviation conglomerate managing dozens of unrelated industrial holdings. The corn picker kept selling, the margins kept narrowing, and in the fields of the Corn Belt, the John Deere combine with the corn head attached was becoming the machine that a successful grain farmer was expected to own, the way the New Idea pull-type picker had once been the machine that a serious corn farmer was expected to run. The shift was not sudden. It was steady. It was structural. And it was the kind of shift that a company owned by people who thought primarily about portfolio returns was poorly positioned to respond to before the window for response had closed. The turning point was not a single event. It rarely is. But if one moment marked the place where the trajectory of New Idea changed from growth to managed retreat, it was the 1970s, the decade in which the American corn farming economy began its structural shift toward large-scale commercial grain production, and the pull-type corn picker began its long transition from mainstream equipment to legacy tool. The forces were not mysterious. They were arithmetic. In 1970, the average American corn farm harvested approximately 140 acres. By 1980, that figure had risen to over 200 acres, driven by federal commodity programs that rewarded production volume, by the availability of operating credit at interest rates that, before 1979, still made expansion appear rational, and by the consolidation of smaller family operations into larger commercial grain enterprises. A 200-acre corn farm could still justify a pull-type picker. A 500-acre corn farm could not justify the labor and equipment complexity that the picker system required. At 500 acres, the combine corn head was not a luxury. It was an efficiency requirement. John Deere understood this arithmetic before New Idea did. Case IH understood it. By 1975, the combine corn head had captured the large commercial grain farm segment of the American corn harvesting market with a completeness that left the pull-type picker competing for a shrinking demographic. The smaller family farm operation that could not yet afford a combine, or that had not yet made the transition. That demographic was real. It was also aging and contracting with each passing season. New Idea's response was to refine what it had. The company's engineers in Coldwater continued to improve the corn picker line. Better snapping roll geometry, improved husking bed roller compounds, updated row unit designs that reduced stalk wrapping and down corn. These were genuine engineering improvements. They made a good machine better. They did not address the fundamental competitive reality that the product category itself was losing ground to a different harvesting system that New Idea had no platform to offer. AAVco, meanwhile, had sold its farm equipment holdings. The New Idea division passed to Allied Products Corporation, a Detroit-based industrial conglomerate that, like AVCO before it, held a diverse portfolio of manufacturing businesses without particular expertise in agricultural equipment. Allied Products managed New Idea through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. The strategic direction remained reactive. The R&D investment remained constrained. The Coldwater plant continued to operate. But the workforce that had peaked between 900 and 1,200 workers in the late 1950s and early 1960s had contracted steadily through the 1970s as production volumes declined and product lines were rationalized. Then the farm credit crisis arrived. Between 1980 and 1986, American agriculture experienced its most severe financial contraction since the 1930s. Interest rates, driven by the Federal Reserve's anti-inflation policy, reached 18 to 20% in 1981 and remained punishingly high through 1982. Land values that had doubled and tripled through the 1970s collapsed by 30 to 50% across the Corn Belt between 1981 and 1986. Farmers who had borrowed against inflated land values to finance equipment purchases and operating expenses found themselves holding debt that their crop revenues could not service. Farm bankruptcies rose, farm foreclosures rose. The implement dealer networks that had sustained American farm equipment manufacturers for a century began to contract. New Idea implement dealers, the independent county seat operations that had been the company's distribution backbone since 1899, were among the casualties. A dealer in Van Wert County, Ohio, who had carried New Idea spreaders and corn pickers for 30 years, could not sustain his floor plan financing, the credit arrangement by which implement dealers borrowed money to stock inventory, repaying the loan when the equipment sold, when the farmers in his territory were not buying. Implement dealers who survived the farm credit crisis did so by consolidating product lines, dropping slower-moving brands, and concentrating on the manufacturers whose dealer support programs were strong enough to help them weather the contraction. John Deere had that program, Case IH had it, New Idea, owned by Allied Products Corporation, did not have it at the scale that mattered. The dealer network that had once numbered in the hundreds across the Corn Belt states contracted to a fraction of its former coverage. A farmer in eastern Indiana who had bought New Idea equipment from a dealer 20 minutes from his farm now found the nearest New Idea dealer 60 miles away, far enough that the service advantage that had once defined the brand's competitive position was effectively eliminated. The forage harvester line continued, the spreader line continued, but the corn picker, the product that had defined New Idea's identity in the American farm equipment market for 60 years, was approaching the end of its commercial life. The market for pull-type corn pickers had not disappeared, but it had shrunk to a size that could no longer sustain the engineering investment and production volume required to keep the product competitive. AGCO Corporation acquired New Idea from Allied Products in 1993. AGCO, the Alice Gleaner Company, formed from the remnants of the Alice Chalmers dealer network after that company's 1985 collapse, was building a portfolio of implement brands to compete with John Deere and Case IH through brand diversity rather than through a single dominant product line. New Idea fit the portfolio. The spreader line was profitable. The forage equipment had a loyal customer base. The Coldwater manufacturing operation was functional. What AGCO did not need was the corn picker line. Production of the New Idea pull-type corn picker ended in the early 1990s. The specific final model year is not precisely documented in public records, but by the time AGCO completed its acquisition, the corn picker was no longer in active production. The machine that had defined New Idea in the American agricultural market for 6 decades was gone from the catalog. The Coldwater plant continued to operate under AGCO ownership for a period. Then production shifted. The workforce contracted further. The manufacturing operations that had employed nearly 1,000 Mercer County workers at their peak were consolidated into AGCO's broader production network, a network that did not require a dedicated facility in western Ohio to produce the spreader and forage equipment volumes that the New Idea brand still generated. The last production line went quiet. The New Idea gate in Coldwater came down. The name remained on the equipment. The town kept the memory. The machines kept working. The name New Idea still exists. AGCO Corporation continues to market spreader and forage equipment under the New Idea badge, cataloged alongside its other implement brands, available through AGCO's dealer network, manufactured at facilities that are not in Coldwater, Ohio. The product bearing the name is real. The equipment works. The spreader line that Joseph Oppenheim's company pioneered in 1899 has a direct commercial descendant in the 21st century. But the name and the place have been separated. What was once inseparable, the New Idea spreader and the Coldwater factory that built it, the New Idea corn picker and the Mercer County machinists who assembled it, is now a brand identity attached to a corporate portfolio entry. The engineering culture of Coldwater, the institutional knowledge of how to build a husking bed that ran clean in wet corn, the specific understanding of what a Corn Belt farmer needed from his equipment and why, none of that transferred with the trademark. The name survived. The town did not keep the factory. What the town kept, and what the broader American farm equipment collector community has preserved with considerable care is the machines themselves. New Idea corn pickers and manure spreaders occupy a specific and respected position in the American farm equipment collector market. On the auction circuits of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, the Macomb farm equipment sales, the Almond auctions liquidations, the county consignment sales that run every spring and fall across the Corn Belt, working New Idea 2-row corn pickers in good mechanical condition, sell consistently in the range of $800 to $2,000, depending on condition and completeness. Restored examples in show condition have sold above $3,000 at regional farm equipment shows. These are not antique curiosities purchased for display. Many of them are bought by small farm operations and hobby farmers who intend to run them, because a properly maintained New Idea pull-type picker set correctly and run at the right ground speed still harvests ear corn from a small acreage with a reliability and simplicity that no combined corn head system can offer at anywhere near the acquisition cost. The New Idea spreader line commands similar loyalty. Ground-driven New Idea spreaders from the 1950s and 1960s appear regularly on farm auction sites, Tractor House, Machine Finder, the classified sections of farm publications, priced between $500 and $1,500 for working examples. The appeal is the same: mechanical simplicity, ease of field repair, compatibility with the older tractor equipment that small farm and hobby farm operators are already running. A New Idea PTO spreader from 1962 has no electronic control modules, no hydraulic sensors, no diagnostic software required to troubleshoot a malfunction in a wet field in November. A farmer with a wrench and a parts manual can fix what breaks. That self-sufficiency was the original promise of the Coldwater Implement Company, and it is the reason the machines have outlasted the company that built them by decades. The collector community centered on this equipment is active and specific. The Antique Power magazine readership, the American Farm Equipment Enthusiast publication that covers pre-1980 farm machinery with the same depth that automotive publications bring to vintage cars, has covered New Idea equipment across multiple issues. The forums at Yesterday's Tractors and the online communities associated with farm equipment restoration maintain dedicated threads on New Idea corn picker adjustment, husking bed roller replacement, and snapping roll timing. Practical knowledge shared between working collectors who run these machines in actual harvest conditions, not only in show rings. The American Precision Museum in Windsor, Vermont, the institutional home of American precision manufacturing history, does not specifically collect farm implement equipment. But the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History holds agricultural mechanization artifacts that document the transition from hand harvesting to mechanical picking that New Idea was central to. The USDA's historical agricultural census records document, decade by decade, the mechanization curve that New Idea's corn picker rode from the 1920s to the 1980s. A statistical record of how completely one machine category transformed American corn farming, and how completely that category was in turn transformed by the combine corn head. The surprise in the New Idea story is not the acquisition, it is the patent record. The husking bed roller design that New Idea refined through the 1940s and 1950s, the specific geometry of paired rubber-covered rollers set at an angle to strip husk leaves from an ear of corn without damaging the kernels, influenced the engineering of corn harvesting attachments developed by subsequent manufacturers. Patent filings in the corn harvesting equipment category through the 1970s and 1980s cite New Idea design references in their prior art documentation. The engineering solutions that the Coldwater design team developed for the problem of mechanical husking did not disappear when the corn picker line was discontinued. They became the foundation on which later designers built. Engineers at companies that had displaced New Idea in the American market were working in part from the technical foundation that Coldwater had laid. The machine that lost the market had already given its best ideas to the machines that replaced it. That is the New Idea story in its fullest form, and it reveals something specific about how the United States treats its precision manufacturing cultures. A company in a small Ohio town solved one of the hardest problems in American agriculture. It solved it well enough that its solution became the standard against which subsequent solutions were measured. It built that solution into a commercial enterprise that employed 1,000 people in Mercer County for decades. And then the forces that end American manufacturing enterprises, conglomerate acquisition, capital allocation decisions made by people with no understanding of the product, a farm credit crisis that destroyed the dealer network, a technology transition that required a capital investment the corporate structure would not authorize, arrived in sequence, as they always do, and the enterprise ended. What did not end was the problem the machine solved. American farmers still spread manure. American farmers still harvest corn. The equipment that does those jobs today carries different names made in different places by companies that may or may not know that a Coldwater, Ohio implement company was the first to do it well. Somewhere in Mercer County, Ohio, on a farm that has been in the same family since before the New Idea Spreader Company was incorporated, a 1961 New Idea 2-row corn picker sits in a machine shed alongside a tractor that is older than most of the people reading about it. Every October, when the corn reaches maturity and the farmer decides the weather window is right, the picker comes out of the shed. The snapping rolls are greased. The husking bed rollers are checked for wear. The elevator chain is tensioned. The tractor is hitched, and the machine moves into the rows, still accurate, still clean, still leaving the field at a loss rate that a Coldwater engineer calculated 70 years ago and found acceptable. The New Idea decal on the side panel is faded. The paint beneath it is worn to bare metal at the corners. The nameplate that once faced a factory floor in Coldwater, Ohio, now faces a cornfield in western Ohio, doing what it was designed to do, in the place it was designed to do it. Long after the company that designed it was absorbed into a portfolio, and the factory that built it was emptied and repurposed and given a different name. See you in the next one.